We are fighting against more than 70 years of our culture.
How do we transform our cities given this resistance to change? Well, we can't.
What is the role then of governments or practitioners to try and push forward changes?
I would say controversy is inevitable.
I said, hey, you're the guy, Benjamin Büttner. I saw you in the newspaper. What are you doing here?
Perhaps parking your car in front of your door is a small sacrifice that we need to make. Welcome, everyone, to the UMX podcast. And on this episode, we are going to talk about urban transformation and resistance to change. So the question is, how do we get our societies to change, even in the face of so many citizens, bureaucracies, and other factors giving us such resistance, right? And to answer this question, I have with me a panel of professionals and academics and a mix of all of the above. And I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself and to state your relationship between practice and academia. Xavier.
Hi, George. I am Xavier Matilla, architect and urbanist, urban planner consultant, and at the same time, professor at the urban planning department at the Polytechnical University of Catalonia. And I was the chief architect of the city of Barcelona between 2019 and 2023.
My name is Benjamin Büttner. I'm heading a research group on accessibility planning at the Technical University of Munich. And I'm also the head of the Doctoral Training Network for EIT Urban Mobility.
I'm Carolyn. I'm a public health specialist, and I coordinate the Urban Planning, Environment, and Health Initiative at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, IS Global.
It's amazing. It's an amazing panel. And just briefly, I'm George Liu. And if you're listening to this, you probably have seen me on UMX. I do science communication through videos. And my thought today is we're all here in Barcelona for work. And it would be so great for us to all sit down and share a few stories about resistance to change, about why it's so frustrating to work with the bureaucracy and sometimes, with society when we have situations that are kind of where science already gives us a solution or the right answer to a problem, but it's difficult to get people on board down that path. And through our stories, we want to explore the urban mobility aspect of that, connections to urban transformation, to health, and to urban design. So let's start with a first story. Maybe Xavi, you can share this story about your work here in Barcelona and resistance to change.
There were many resistance to some of the transformations that we tried to set up in Barcelona during this period within Superblock program or other ones. I remember, as an example, some friends, some colleagues, urbanists also complaining against some changes that we had thought for the central area of Barcelona, the Champla within Superblock program, the new green axis. Complain against the problems that it probably will cause on those different streets in the surrounding areas. But after the transformation, they realized that the changes has been totally positive, not only for people in there, but for the people who wants to walk through the Champla right now. So probably people always is thinking in a short period impacts. So this is why at the beginning it's always so difficult to convince neighbors and people living on the territory which are the benefits for them in a long-term period or a mid-term period. I would say this is the best way to defend that kind of changes. Just providing real changes that make people visit the new places and to check that they are properly working.
Okay, so I have a question for you because there's a narrative built around the city of Barcelona and the superblocks. My impression was that this whole city would be covered in superblocks and it would all look like that. But that's really not the case currently. And there has been resistance despite earlier success, right? So what is the story behind that? Where was, why stop there? And how do we deal with that resistance to make more of these positive changes in the future?
I will say, first of all, that that kind of deep changes in our cities need time. So I think the most important thing is to start the transformation and to open the discussions with people and different profiles complaining against this or saying that it will be better or we should stop that. After these 8 years where we set up different new superblock sites around the city, the local government has decided to stop it. Okay. But there is still an open discussion about that. Even I would say it's probably necessary to stop for a while sometimes to look back to the projects and to identify which will be better, what will be the improvements to this project. So I think we will need more time to have enough perspective to have a real good idea about what is happening. So I think probably the most success thing was to talk about again public space in the city, to put health at the center of the discussion, to create a new public agenda around public space.
I'm going to be a little rebellious and take a step back to talk about public health in general. So, if we look at some of the recent history of public health, what we can also see is that a lot of the measures, key public health measures that have been very successful in protecting her health, actually didn't have a lot of popular support in the beginning. We could talk about our like smoking bans, seatbelt laws, and speed limits. These are all demonstrated very well in the literature and through scientific evidence to be very effective and necessary. And yet there was never like a massive outcry from the population saying, yes, please limit smoking, please make us drive slower. But they were very necessary. So then they're very successful and people tend not to want to go back. But there is always kind of a natural process where people can be against change in general, against things that they feel will affect their lifestyle or what they perceive as their individual rights to do things that, or individual behaviors. But then we do see that people are able to recognize the benefits. Who now, for instance, in most cities in Europe would want to go and dine in a restaurant where you could smoke? Most people would say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. If you live on a street that has a reduced speed limit and you have children or pets or anyone in general would say, no, I want cars to drive much faster down my street. So this is a natural, I think, process of human nature that can happen. And we need to be aware of that, but we also need, I think, to be aware of the limits, of where we can get in terms of public agreement and consensus to some of these aspects.
So you mentioned public health, and there's a reason why public health has that connection with urban space, urban mobility, with the potential transformation of urban space, and it's not individual health, right? Individual health is something that we can control. Public health is something that only society can control, right?
I think we're getting to a point in the mobility discussion where we're realizing that some aspects of the mobility model, or many of them, are creating these dysfunctions or these negative aspects for public health. And therefore, we need to kind of create a new vision for mobility that prioritizes the public and these health arguments. But that's not easy to do because mobility is very much still perceived by many people as this individual right of my behavior, and I want to be able to carry out my behavior in the way that I see fit. I've left you speechless.
I see a connection here between this transformation in public health and also a transformation in the way that we deal with public space, with mobility. It's the commons in our urban environment. It is, for example, more traffic. It's not an individual choice. I can't, as someone that lives in my neighborhood, influence how much traffic other than my own choice of choosing whether or not to drive. So this transformation and this unpopularity, right, of trying to deal with these social decisions. And when dealing with public space, we also have a very interesting example from Munich around this street experiment called the Steinhuber mini block, which brings us to a third story about resistance and change.
Yes, Steinhuber mini block, as the name already says, was heavily influenced by the excellent work that has been done in Barcelona with the super blocks. Not just in Munich, but you can find it all over the world, actually. In Vienna, they have Superkratze, which they always then adapt the concept of the super blocks to the local context, which I think is very important. So what works in Barcelona might not work in Vienna, might not work in Munich. What we try to do is doing a street experiment, tactical urbanism, where we tried for 3 months. How would that work in a Munich context, in a much smaller context also? That's why it's mini. It's just 2 streets. But we tried to use some of the principles of the superblocks, avoiding through traffic, making it more tricky for cars to pass by. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to really block the street for 3 months. But we replaced 20 parking lots. And we created all kind of different parklets with different uses. So basically within this 21 parking spots, we use them for library where people can meet and exchange books, can also exchange ideas. We had lots of urban gardening, we had public spaces, and we also, which was very important in our opinion, were 2 mobility points or hubs. So we tried to bring the neighbors on board at the beginning and ask them, hey, what would you like to see in your neighborhood? What would you like to see outside your doorstep? And before we really did the whole plan and established everything, we put posters on each of the doors. Some people complained, why do you put all the poster over? It's too much. But at the end, by this, we were able to get people outside and talk with them. What might be their needs, their preferences? What are they missing in their street? The most crucial thing was removing 21 parking spots. And that's why we said you have those mobility hubs where we give you minutes to try something new. And I think that's crucial. Make people try something for a little time. So they were having minutes for cargo bikes, for e-scooters, for also car sharing, bike sharing. So the opportunity to see, am I really that car dependent? So we thought, okay, nice approach. Let's try it for 3 months. First day when it was implemented, I went on the street, and all of a sudden I've been approached by someone living there, a neighbor, and she said, "Hey, you're the guy, Benjamin Büttner. I saw you in the newspaper. What are you doing here?" Quite hostile. And I said, "Yeah, that's me. Who are you? Yeah, what you do is not okay. For you, it's just a game. We're like guinea pigs for you, like a living lab, but not in a very positive term." And at the end, she said, "You're threatening my livelihood. I'm dependent on my car. I have to commute, and what you do is not okay. And I'm paying for this. I'm paying for the on-street parking." Can you take a guess how much you have to pay in Munich for 1 year of on-street parking? 30 euros. So it's 30 euros for a full year of on-street parking. And that already shows the problematic here that our most precious resource in the city, the space, is giving away that free for car use. And I think that's problematic. But the other thing that shows this story, I think, is that we do not communicate the right way. So basically, reading something what happens in your neighborhood in the newspaper is not the right way. So you have to get in touch with neighbors and really try to co-design, really see how we could improve together, make them part of the process. Yeah, and so I think here we failed a little bit, even though we tried. But yeah.
Yes, I think we need to take into account that we are fighting against more than 70 years of cult culture
Yeah.
in our blood, I would say. So it's not easy to change the mindset of people that are used for not only for their lives, but for many generations to use the car as a way of life, I would say. So this is, I think, so important, which is the role of health and all that kind of changes. I think there was a turning point when we started to talk again about health, thanks to Corona crisis, probably because everybody understand that if there is a health problem or there are health impacts and there are premature deaths, it's worth to try the changes.
And so I would ask you, as working and implementing these things, it is true that we need participation of people. But when we have a measure like this, much like smoking and some of these others, it's also probably true that it's going to be difficult to get a huge consensus on what we need to do. And there's always going to be people who are against it because, as we said, specifically with mobility, we almost can't remember a time when cars weren't this very valued thing that touch a lot of fundamental values that they've been associated with, like freedom and prosperity and power. And so, changing that is hard for people. But knowing that there's going to be this resistance at one point, or what is the balance between being able to go forward, even though you don't have consensus necessarily from the population. What is the role then of governments or practitioners to try and push forward changes?
Yeah, when it comes to that kind of public space transformation, I would say controversy is inevitable. You cannot wait to reach the 100% consensus. You need to start and to be prepared to manage the controversy, to have knowledge, to have data, to have the enough tools to manage this relation and this exchange with people. I think it's quite important. If we should wait to reach this 100%, we never start anything, and it will be quite difficult to provide these changes. One of my learned lessons during those years at the city council is when you have the opportunity to change things, you need to be bold and you need to go as fast as possible. Probably when you have the opportunity to provide real changes, because the best way to defend that is providing that they are working properly, and this is what we tried.
And the way I see it, the game is actually rigged against social change, right? It takes one loud individual voice who needs their parking, or one person who really wants to smoke in a restaurant, to kind of impact the entire environment around them. So if we think about this idea of the one person, this one voice of resistance to change, versus a potential good that could be done for the rest of the community, how do we deal with this fundamental problem of the individual versus society? And Xavi, you talked about having a strong vision, having a, a strong social movement. But if there's one or two people who resist, how do we smooth that over to say, hey, this is for the social good, this impacts many people in the community, and this is where we're going as a society, as a neighborhood, as a city, perhaps. Is that acceptable?
And probably that kind of urban changes must start with a top-down decision. So I think there probably is needed the enough political will and enough technical knowledge to start uh, the transformation, and then to be prepared to manage the controversy, to have enough strength to resist the different opinions people complain against that, and to be prepared to go as fast as possible, because the best way to discuss with people who is against the project is to discuss after the works are finished. So most of the changes that I realized during those years were people that once the works were finished in Superblock sites, they were changing their opinion. So I think the best way to change people opinion and some individual voices against that is to invite them to visit real changes. So I think it's important not only to prepare plans, to announce ideas, but to get real changes in our cities.
An experimentation, and that requires momentum. Yeah.
I think I would add to that, when thinking about top-down approaches, I would maybe clarify to say, when we're talking about public goods and when it's very clear that the evidence says that this is something that we need to do, right? And in the case of the urban mobility, transformations that we need, there is abundant evidence about air pollution, noise pollution, physical activity, a lot of things that are related to this mobility model that are really telling us we need a change. It actually wasn't so long ago when cars were the innovation that were transforming our cities, and people at that time were against cars coming into cities, and we've forgotten that because, it was long enough now that's not part of our collective vision and history. We see the same pattern of resistance time and time again on almost every street, every neighborhood, every city, where people don't want us to calm streets. They don't want to have these mobility restrictions and changes. And then we do it, and then people actually are happy because it does bring many benefits. So it's but yet we keep repeating the same story and over. So how do we get to scale, with not having to fight the same fight over and over again? And I think that that's tricky. And then, bringing citizens in is also, there is a push right now to engage people, and citizen participation is a buzzword, and that is true. And I think, but we need to be careful about that because people are busy, they have a lot going on, and we need to be respectful about what we're asking them to participate in. And so I think it's important to distinguish. We should not be asking people to spend their time demonstrating or participating that they need clean air or nature in cities or reduce noise, because these are things that we know that we need to live well. What we need to be asking them to participate is what this should look like in their neighborhood, right? And so I think, unfortunately, we've kind of mixed it all up and asking people to spend a lot of time on things that we already know that we need to do. And, people get worn down, or then they don't want to be involved. And then you get these one or two angry voices because people are more apt to speak out when they have a complaint than when they have a compliment. That's human nature. But at the end of the day, we're talking about common goods. And I think both society and politicians and those who are in charge of governments need to understand this is actually their responsibility. This is their job to protect the collective goods, because we know as individuals we're not good at thinking that way.
Totally agree. And I think when it comes to public participation, we also have to find new ways of doing that. I think much more playful ways to engage citizens. And for now, I think we are very bad at this, to be honest. And we have to make people really picture their street, their neighborhood, picture their future. And for that, we developed something we called Flowers of Proximity, which is basically an easy way of painting a flower. Each petal stands for one of the dimensions of the 50-minute city. And here you can say, okay, I'm willing to walk to the next supermarket within 7 minutes. And everyone can do that. Older people can do it. Young kids can handcraft these flowers. And by this, we can really, in a playful way, make people visualize how they would like to live in the future. And then the interesting part is looking at a flower from Munich to one to Barcelona, to one in Beijing, or comparing a flower from older people to young kids, to people that are very active and fit, to one that have mobility restrictions. And by this, I think we can also change our perspective and not just plan for ourselves, which we often do, unfortunately, very selfish. So I will plan the city as I wish it should look like. But at the end, we have to change perspectives. And by this, we also have to listen to citizens. I think that's quite important.
Yes, and following on this participation issue, we should also consider that there are different levels of controversy and resistances. The normal one with people living there, that of course it's natural, it's a human behavior, they are aware about some changes in their lives, but there is a higher level of discussion with some economical powers and media, really powerful media, that, for instance, we suffer here in Barcelona, trying to change and to get different opinions from the people. So most of the people here, we realize that we're complaining against the projects, not because they were neighborhoods or the superblock sites, because they were reading every day and listening every day on some different medias that we were destroying the city. It was a problem. And this is why it's so important. And Benjamin told about that the communication of that kind of projects, and communication is quite important to explain. Of course, we have not spent time explaining that we need clean air, but we need time and sources in order to explain people that that kind of changes are needed for that kind of health conditions. Okay.
And academics are very bad at this, by the way. So they tend to write publications that no one outside of academia would ever touch. So I think the example from ICE Global with this color book, drawing book, the comic book, I think that
infographics.
yeah,
ICE Global are really good ones.
that's excellent, and that's the way forward how we can reach a wider range of the population.
But I think it also touches on something that you've both said, or all three of you have actually said, that we put a lot of emphasis on getting individuals to change their behavior and individual recognition. And I think we also know from public health that asking individual people to change what they do and change their behaviors when we don't make the right changes to the environment to facilitate that is really a very long and hard road that doesn't get us very far. So, tying in back to some of these other themes is how do we get leaders to create this common vision that is informed by citizens, but that we're all kind of imagining our collective future? And the example that you gave about the flowers is great because, we need a better idea. And we're in time of transition right now. So, clearly, there's a lot of different opinions about what our future should look like. But how do we get at least some minimum common consensus and then leaders who are willing to stand by that, even though it can sometimes be unpopular, but knowing that it really isn't quite fair to ask people to make changes in the way that they move, for instance, or the way that they live their lives if the environment itself, we need to engage with people and help understand what they need, but we also need to be willing to make structural important changes and do them in a quality way and keep them maintained so that making these behavioral choices is a lot easier.
It should be also important to consider that probably public space or health conditions and public space is not a priority for people because they have other bigger problems in their lives. So I think it's also a matter of rights on how are we able to provide rights to housing affordability, jobs for people. So we will able to discuss about public space transformation is before that all people has a decent house, has a decent job, and after that we can start a real discussion about other kind of things. So I think it's also needed to take into account, and it was our approach at the City Council of Barcelona. We can talk about rights, and health, of course, is one of the main rights in the city. Of course, health is a priority right over drive a car, but there are also other main important rights that should be provided in the city.
I would plead that accessibility should be a human right. So at the end, it changed a bit the paradigm. There was a paradigm shift from mobility-centered accessibility, where you basically invest a lot in highways, maybe also high-speed rail, where you're trying to get very fast from A to B to the next huge mall, shopping mall, and by this we cut down the travel time. However, we at the same time extended the distances, which was very problematic. And now, also, as Xabi mentioned before, during COVID-19, we shifted a bit, and we shifted from mobility-centered accessibility to proximity-centered accessibility, which brings us much closer on a neighborhood scale, which then allows us to hopefully walk or cycle to the next supermarket and not using a car anymore. And I think by creating more denser, more mixed-use urban structures in a pleasant, in a comfortable, in a safe way for everyone to use. By this, we can really shrink in the negative externalities from transport, mainly cars.
And I think, unfortunately, we're still in a situation where, because of many factors, not the least commercial or economic interest, we're still spending a lot of time asking about what are the cars that we need of the future and what do they need to be flying? Do they need to be electric? Do they need to be bigger? Do they need to be smaller? When really the question we need to be asking is, how do people need to be moving in cities? And, I think our mobility needs of today are drastically different than they were, 30, 40 years ago, and we're kind of framing the question in the wrong way. We're asking about a specific technology because it's still so ingrained in us, but we really need to broaden our thinking. What does this mobility need to be? It needs to be more proximal, it needs to be more sustainable, it needs to be more active. And how do we get there? And again, what are the infrastructure and governance models? And at some point, regulation, because some of these things people will not do unless it is regulated and given to us as something that we need to do, like we've seen, like I said, with smoking and some other things. So how do we bring that all together? Again, starting with kind of a better shared vision. It's a hard time right now because we're polarized about so many things. But how can we be working I think especially at the local level, to be focusing more on that?
It's interesting that we started this conversation, and in my head, it's framed for me as a bit of a tragedy, right? One individual wants to park their car, and the benefits to that individual is so massive, being able to park your car in front of your door, that the society impacts of that become quite distant in comparison, right? So you could say a better space for your children, or air quality benefits for the neighborhood. But to be able to park your car in front of your house, it's like, wow, that's amazing everyday convenience. And I think through the conversation that we're having so far, you're mentioning more towards the opportunities that exist from having a better society, from having fulfilling more of people's access to housing, from access to opportunities in the flower of proximity, access to better health benefits in their daily lives. And these are all opportunities that we can strive for as society. And what we're asking for are these slight sacrifices, right? So if we think as a society we can achieve all of these things, uh, perhaps parking your car in front of your door is a small sacrifice that we need to make. And I would love to see that more in public consultation, is that acknowledgement, right? So turning I need my parking space, in the case of the Steinhuber mini block and probably many other places, turning that I need my parking space to say, okay, like we acknowledge that this is a sacrifice that you individual have to make. Look at all these benefits we could achieve as a society, right? And I think that that would be cool to have that conversation.
I think one place that you can see that more and more is around school environments. There's an initiative called Street for Kids, among others, where they're trying to really make a push to change the environments, the streets around schools, and make them more child friendly. We have a lot of situations where there's air pollution, there's fast cars, and noise, and all of these things we know affect children's health and their ability actually to learn. And so this is one area where I think there is a little bit less resistance, not always, but people in general are often willing to understand that children are a population that need to be protected. They have special needs developmentally and physically. And so I think this is where we're seeing a bit of movement. And this can be a really nice transition point for transformation, because if we can get people to realize the benefits in schools, because in cities, most neighborhoods have schools, and we can appreciate the benefits there, then maybe we can extend that model to others. And I do think that that's one area, and where people are willing to take more collective action because they realize the benefits, and it's an opportunity for health and well-being and quality of life and economics, which is something which can be our next podcast. And I'm not a mathematician or an economist, so I can't tell you exactly why. But, in a lot of these discussions, putting in a parking space still comes up as the economically best decision. And that is absolutely not true. If we were to do a proper, more holistic calculation of what the costs and benefits are. So I think we need to be approaching this discussion, with from many different angles and many different sectors, but really changing some of the fundamentals around the way that we're talking about this, the benefits that we're choosing instead of efficiency, quality of life, and things like that. And I think we do now have the methodology. We have a lot of academics who are here to help us. Cities could be better about working with them, and academics too, about willing to go out, and work with cities on these.
Maybe I can add one additional benefit to your very long and impressive list, Carolyn. It would be social cohesion. And I think social cohesion is also very important nowadays, even more than it used to be. And so creating public spaces, new public spaces, give us the nice opportunity that everyone is welcome there. And you hardly see that anymore in cities. So no matter if you're poor, if you're rich, no matter if you're young, if you're old, no matter if you're fit or if you're handicapped, everyone can meet at this. And it's always astonishing for me when I go to Barcelona and when go through the super blocks. I see so many old and handicapped people, wheelchair users. Normally they are trapped in their apartments, hardly able to go out. And I think we have to provide more spaces like this. At the same time, you see so many kids playing on the street. Again, I have to say, in a safe, fun manner. So I think that's beautiful to see, and we have to create those spaces. So social cohesion is very important, and for that we have to create places that are commercial free, where people are invited just to hang out and talk to each other, exchange ideas, get to know each other. Stuff like that.
Yes, I could say that car is still a symbol of wealth in our cities. I am sure that in the future it will change. And there is a risk on that, because probably in the future, wealthy people will be able to reach their works just walking or biking, but probably low incomes people won't be able to do that and will need the car. So I think there is a tricky situation in the future, and it's our responsibility to approach the problem as an equity issue, providing accessibility equally to everyone. So the question is if we will be able to provide the same conditions to everyone. So what is now a symbol of wealth, car probably can become a kind of poverty symbol in the future. So we should avoid that kind of risk.
And our task as academics is creating instruments that show this clearly. Where are the areas that are underserved, for instance, when it comes to public transportation, when it comes to a safe cycling infrastructure. For that, at TUM, we developed the Injustice Atlas, so an accessibility tool where you can scan and then see where we really need to invest more and get also people along.
So let's bring this full circle as we bring this podcast to a close. And we started with the question, how can we transform our cities given people's resistance to change, right? And we have not solved it, surprise, in the course of this podcast. But I think something you mentioned as academics, what do we do, right? But something I think that academics do really well is to struggle with these big conceptual problems. So I'm not going to ask you for the one answer to this question, but rather I want to ask you to share with us, what problem do you want to see people struggle with, engage with more to help us move forward? I'll give you an example of a problem that I would like to see people struggle with more, and you probably pick this up throughout the course of this podcast. How do we transform our cities given this resistance to change? Well, we can't. There's no way, because the individual incentives to private gains is so strong that there's no way I'm going to give up my parking space for cleaner air, abstract concepts. And yet we somehow do manage this transformation, right? And we see it regularly. Even in the face of strong individual incentives, societies do change. So I see that as something being very positive, and I would like to see more people think about how we struggle with this problem of tragedy of the commons. So for each of you, what is something that you want to see society struggle with more?
I would say that the effects of this new climate that we will be suffering, we are already suffering right now. I think I would like to see people struggling, asking how to adapt in a faster way our cities to this climate change, who is closely related to mobility.
I would like people to struggle a little bit more with what are the real costs of car-centered mobility. And I think in general, people are not very good at understanding risk or sometimes the costs of the things that we're really talking about. So if we were to sit down and do an individual Excel, and I as a car owner, what is it really costing me to drive, to park, to put in gasoline and all of these things? And I think most people are not really aware for, a tool, which is the car that we use maybe for a few hours every day on average, what are the actual costs, not only economically, but importantly, but also then to health. So a little bit more of awareness and struggle with that. And then on the flip side is, the connection between public space and health. I think we're in an age where we're very indoor focused. People spend more time indoors than they ever have before, but really thinking more intentionally when we walk down the street or when we're in public space, what am I seeing? What am I feeling around me? And how does it make me feel? And what are the things that could change for that me to live better and feel less stress in the environment that I'm in?
I would like people to struggle a bit more with the decision that they take when they opt for their individual comfort, which could be a car usage, and seeing about how they might negatively impact others by that. However, I also think we should look at the comfort-based accessibility a bit and ask them, look, your perceived accessibility might be very different to your actual accessibility, so there is sometimes a mismatch. By creating more walkable, cyclable environments, people might also not go for the fastest route, but more for the most pleasant route. And I think we should achieve these neighborhoods where people say, this is for me actually the most pleasant way to move. And by this, hopefully, also the society doesn't have to suffer.
Can I be a little bit rebellious once again and just say, so we brought it back to individuals, but one of my main points before is that these questions need to not only put all the responsibility on the individual to make the change, but also on the structural and government levels. So maybe we could also ask the question of what do we want governments and those who are elected, and are responsible for making a lot of the policies and interventions and regulations about this, what do we want them to struggle with? Because I think, running the risk of putting this all as individual responsibility is ultimately not going to get us where we want to be.
One of the great pleasures of having good conversations with brilliant guests is the pleasure of walking away from a conversation with more questions than you came in with. And I hope for the viewers, the listeners, that you also had this experience on this journey with us to have these questions. And I encourage you to also think about the things that we struggle with on our daily lives as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for listening. See you next time.